Thank you, Mr. Gibson. Madam Auditor.
Thank you, Mr. Roth. There's a variety of objectives that Chairman Gibson is asking us to look at. First is looking at rebenching. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the rebenching process that the university system is undergoing at this moment, and it's been underway for a few years now. What Mr. Gibson is interested in having us do is what process did UC use to develop the rebenching initiative, and how did they develop? There's a weighted basis. Certain students are given a weighted amount to determine rebenching. Graduate students are weighted at a higher amount than an undergraduate student, and that's supposed to be reflecting the cost of educating a graduate student versus an undergraduate student. He's also interested in us looking at the extent to which UC reached out to stakeholders, primarily undergraduate and graduate students. Did they engage in a process with students who would be affected by or who attend the University of California campuses? And when they were developing these rebenching recommendations, did they engage with undergraduate and graduate students? In addition to that, Mr. Gibson wants us to look at the UC process in the implementation of rebenching, but also the funding stream initiatives. The funding stream initiative is some decision-making that was made a few years ago to allow campuses to retain certain fees that they charge. Non-resident tuition is one example. They can keep that revenue on campus. That was a decision that was made by the University of California. So Chairman Gibson is asking us to not only look at rebenching, but also to look at the funding stream initiatives and evaluate that as well, and what the impact of those are on per student and campus funding. In addition to that, the process for rebenching, the goal is to have that accomplished by 2018. He is asking my office to determine whether or not UC is on track, essentially, to be able to complete that goal by 2018. In addition to that, related to rebenching, he's interested in us determining how much state support is included in rebenching, and of the state support that's not included in rebenching, how is that funding being used or distributed to the various campuses in California. Assemblymember Gibson also referred to the inequities we identified at those 4 campuses when we conducted the audit that we issued in July of 2011, the underrepresented students, and he's asking us to determine whether or not UC has really fully addressed that particular issue. So that's a key objective that he's asked us to do. In addition, he is asking us to review and evaluate the UC's methods for determining resident and non-resident enrollment targets. Do the individual university campuses identify those targets? How do they go about doing that? And how do they determine how much they will charge a non-resident student to attend college in the UC system? And how does that compare to comparable universities in the United States? And there are some schools that UC compares themselves to, and we've done those types of comparisons in the past, so that's something we certainly believe we can do. Another objective is asking us to look at a 10-year window and try to identify a trend in projections of non-resident student enrollment and the associated tuition. As I'm sure you've all heard at the JLAC hearing that Mr. Gibson and many of you attended a couple of weeks ago, or a few weeks ago now, the number of non-resident students in California has increased significantly over the last few years. So he is asking us to look at a 10-year window and what is the impact on enrollment, and what has that impact been on California students gaining or perhaps not gaining access to University of California, being able to attend a campus here in California. Another issue that came up at the JLAC oversight hearing that we had back in February was outreach. So Mr. Gibson is asking us to determine the level of outreach that the university system, again for a 10-year window, is conducting, particularly with respect to underrepresented communities and students in those communities. What type of outreach are they conducting? And then he's also interested in having us look at the ethnic and racial background of students who ultimately enrolled in the UC system. For a 5-year window, Mr. Gibson's asking us to look at 5 fiscal years and evaluate how UC and the campuses are actually using that non-resident student tuition, the revenue generated from that. As Mr. Gibson indicated in his statement, he has asked us to look at compensation packages. Again, this is looking at a 5-year window and looking at total compensation packages for top executives and management personnel at UC and the respective campuses. This is work we've done in the past. It's been a few years now since we've done it, so we will certainly be able to do that tapping into their payroll system. We've done that in the past. Again, he's asking us to compare that to comparable universities and other private and public universities across the country. And then the last objective is really going back and looking at the audit we completed in July of 2011 and determining the status of the recommendations. This is something we do on an ongoing basis, but what we believe we'll do during the course of this audit is, rather than rely on the assertions of the university, which is typically what we do when we get responses from agencies, since we'll be conducting the audit, now we'll ask for documentary evidence. You asserted that you implemented a certain policy. We need to see evidence of that policy. So we will follow up on the recommendations made in that July 2011 report and be able to give the legislature a very specific status on how well UC has implemented each of those recommendations. That is the entire scope. Our budget is about 3,600 hours. Again, an audit that size is going to take us between 8 and 9 months to get done.
Thank you, Madam Auditor. Representatives from UC.
Chair Gibson, Vice Chair Roth, and members of the committee, Steve Juarez with the University of California once again, and I have joining me with me is Kieran Flaherty, who's the Interim Director of Budget for the university. And given I think the intense and extensive discussions that occurred on February 11th relative to most of the issues in the audit, we would defer to the committee in any questions you have, and happy to respond as the committee members might like.
Member questions? Any questions? Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Gibson, for doing this. We need this information. If there's one thing we're learning, we need information on what's really happening with non-residents and the effect it's having on our resident students. You know, yesterday, part of the conversation that Ms. Napolitano had was that at UCLA and UC Berkeley, there will be a cap on non-resident students, but there won't be more spaces available to California residents. And these are both campuses where they're not reaching the resident goals already on the books. And so this is valuable information for us to have, and I thank you. Questions for Madam Auditor, and that is, we discussed at the oversight hearing last month that UC is working on reinstituting and tracking some of their budget information. So that they can have a plan internally, and they can more readily make data available to us and to you. Does this audit request cover, whether it's reviewing prior goals, cover that and check on them and how they're doing in that regard?
Yes, Assemblymember Baker, I believe the objective that we talked about as far as looking at prior recommendations, because we had very specific recommendations about the transparency of their budgeting process, and some of that we certainly have been tracking all of that, but we would follow up under Objective 11 in the scope of objectives that the committee has before it.
Any further questions? Senator Bell.
Yeah, I think the main interest that I have in the audit, I appreciate the Chair's work that he's doing on this, is that to what extent, when you look at that 10-year focus, to what extent fiscal policies dictated admissions policies, and to determine whether or not the fiscal policies of the university are primarily dictating admissions policies and the students that we have. When somebody tells me, well, we're going to change the rules and stop admissions based on the fiscal policy, okay, I want to know that. But what happened over the 10-year period in terms of policies, formal or informal, to have the fiscal situation drive the admissions policies of the University of California? And we need to know whether or not that happened, to what extent it happened, and what the implications have been for California students that are trying to get admissions into the University of California. Did it delay or push down our students in California? And that's what I hope to receive when the audit's finished. Thank you.
Any further questions? Senator Lara.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, Is the audit also going to include, when you talk about students, does this include graduate students as well?
Well,
Or can we look at graduate students as well?
Well, the questions that Mr. Gibson asked us, in a variety of places, we will be looking at graduate students as well, because with respect to outreach and determining the rebenching initiative, did they reach out to both undergraduate and graduate students? When they came up with the weighting factors to determine how rebenching would work, one of the rating factors is a graduate student, I think that gets 5 points, and an undergraduate is 1. We'll need to look at both, all of that, to determine how they decided to come up with a weighting factor of 1 versus 5. So I would contemplate, based on what we've been asked to do, it would include both undergraduate and graduate students.
Okay, because what we're trying to get at, and I know we were at the hearing, we were discussing that I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, that I think it was like 50% of the graduate students at the UC were out of state or international. So, and when we're talking about one African American in the UCLA Law School, that we're actually looking at the graduate programs as well. So I just want to make sure we don't miss that opportunity to review that graduate section.
Can I comment on that, Chair?
Certainly, go ahead.
Yes, and we draw from a much different pool for graduate students, first of all. Second of all, this heralded story about one African admit at UCLA is not true. They typically admit anywhere from 35 to 45 African American students per year. They typically enroll anywhere from 8 to 15. And I know that's sort of gotten around the building, so I just feel the need to correct that impression. But we certainly would welcome a look at the way in which we select graduate students, and I think it's appropriate for the audit.
I think you would also understand that 15 is pretty low for California.
Thank you. Madam Auditor, just a couple from me. Will your audit address the impact of the health center income on campuses? It's my understanding that the campuses are permitted to retain the income generated by the health centers, those campuses that have them, and in particular the impact of that retained income on the weighting factors utilized for both medical students and residents on the campus. So I don't know if you can answer that, but I hope your analysis will cover that.
It's a difficult question to answer, but I do believe when we're looking at the weighting factors, as you indicated, if to the extent that the health medical centers is included in some of that process, we absolutely would look at that. But I don't have a full answer to your question at the moment.
Well, I hopefully the audit will take a look at that. It's my understanding the health center income is retained on the campuses where the health centers are located. It's my further understanding that the health center income is significant, and to the extent that additional weighting is allocated to both medical students and certainly to residents who are employed providing services in part, that I hope your audit will take a look at that to determine whether the weighting factors are appropriate. And then my second question is, with respect to the concept of unfunded students, it's my understanding that some campuses have them, some campuses do not. Will your audit take a look at the concept of the unfunded student and whether the system appropriately reallocates money to compensate those campuses that have attempted to expand their enrollment base without funding being allocated by the system?
So if I'm to understand your question, Senator, when you're referring to I'm not familiar with the terminology an unfunded student, so you mean a California resident where the university system has been provided a certain budget amount and that equates to 10,000 students and perhaps they enroll 15,000 students as California residents. We did look at that in the July 2011 report. We actually have an example in there. So it would be, I believe it would be important for us to include that in the analysis as well as far as looking at, and I think Senator Bell's question about determining admissions policy. Is the policy, has the policy been over the years to enroll as many students as possible regardless of the amount of state funding, or has the policy changed to determine we've only been given funding for X number of California resident students, and that's where we're going to stop enrolling. So I think we would look at that analysis in a variety of the objectives in the scope of the audit.
Or have some campuses determined to attempt to meet the need regardless of what the system has indicated? Because it's my understanding some campuses have no or virtually few unfunded students, and some campuses have several thousand students that are, quote, unfunded, even though the legislature doesn't fund UC on a per-student basis. But this analysis apparently is something we're going to undertake.
We would be able to address that during the course of the audit, absolutely, because I think we would want to look at all of the campuses across the board, the 10 campuses, and determine exactly that. How many of those have unfunded students, and was it a policy decision? Do the individual campuses, how much flexibility and autonomy, essentially, do they have to make some of those decisions? I think that absolutely needs to be contemplated in the scope.
And is there a plan to fund them appropriately? Thank you. Any further questions? Members? Senator Bell.
I had a question for Steve, if I could. Does the university keep records of students that were not admitted to the university but were, you know, if there was additional, obviously if there's additional slots they would have been, do you keep a rank of those people?
Not to my knowledge. We will get back to you and the committee on that, but it's my understanding that in terms of being selected for a particular campus is, I think, what you say
so
admitted.
If you had a number of applicants and then they were ranked and, you know, there were a certain number of slots available and, you know, you got to 75 and who was 76 through 150?
Well, typically, I do know that once the selections are made, meaning that admissions letters have gone out, you're either on one list or the other, unless we've created a waiting list. And it may be through an examination of the waiting list, and to the extent that we are able to get to those folks, that we would have an indication of the sort that you're
the
suggesting.
waiting list, they have them broken down by residencies?
That would be the case.
So I think I'm interested in, like, okay, we had a waiting list here for this campus, and you know there was X number of slots available, and the waiting list consisted of you know these students that we're trying to get in. I'd like to know what the socioeconomic, ethnic status of those people on the waiting list are, and I also like to know just the data. I mean, we need the data on that, and then also in response to Senator Lara's comment. I think it's very interesting. It'd be very interesting to see the ethnic and socioeconomic status of the law school admissions over the last couple decades, I'd say.
And we can certainly provide that independent of the audit. But let me just
independent of the audit. You don't need to go through the audit.
Let me just be clear about one thing in terms of waiting lists. We don't typically use waiting list as a primary mechanism to keep students sometimes. And in fact, we're looking at it this year because of the uncertainties related to having sufficient state funding for our growth. We had estimated a growth of 1%, which is about 2,200 students. What the President announced yesterday was that we sort of have to hold on that. It's our fervent hope that we do get to those students, and the ways that we can do that are through things like waiting list, and hopefully we still have those students when we find out what our level of funding is going to be. But we don't typically rely heavily on waiting list, and we also, because most of our campuses are on our quarter system, we don't do a lot of what CSU does, which is to admit for a winter quarter. Berkeley has done a little bit in the past, but I think we can get you some sense of the information to the extent that we have waiting list, what the makeup of those folks might be.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Any further questions? I assume, I remember from the last hearing that we had, there was some issue about access to data and all that. I assume that the system will fully cooperate and provide the auditor with whatever data the auditor needs to address these issues. Thank you very much. Public comment. Come on down.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. I'm Marianne Massenberg, and I'm a union rep for the UAW Academic Locals. And among our membership, we represent 14,000 mostly graduate student employees at UC who work as teaching assistants, providing instruction to undergrads and readers and tutors. You're correct, Senator Lara, that approximately 50% of grad students, including our working members at UC, are non-residents. So we obviously have an interest in the outcome of this audit, and we're not opposing it. But I did want to point out a couple of things for consideration in the possible audit, and that is that you probably know that in most universities, the graduate student enrollment does reflect a higher number of out-of-state and international students. And in California, it's correct as well. It's very uncommon, or certainly less common, to go to grad school at the same university you attended or even the same state. So I think if you look at other universities throughout the country, you'll see the 50% figure is not unusually high, simply because people are often encouraged by advisors to attend grad school somewhere else to get a broader perspective. So just something to consider. The other thing, too, is we are interested, as Senator Bell expressed, in who is not admitted. And we ask you also to consider that the rate, the appallingly low rate of underrepresented admissions at our California institutions is, I think, less due to the number of non-resident admissions than to our collective failure as Californians to deal effectively with the outcome of Prop 209. So thank you for your consideration.
Thank you for your comment. Any further public comment? Hearing none, do I have a motion to approve the... It's been moved and seconded. Madam Secretary, please call the roll.
Assemblymember Gibson.
Aye.
Gibson, aye. Ashajian. Ashajian, aye. Baker. Campos. Jones. Jones, aye. Nazarian. Nazarian, aye. Rendon. Senator Roth.
Aye.
Roth, aye. Bell. Aye. Bell, aye. Cannella. Cannella, aye. Fuller. Aye. Fuller, aye. Galgiani. Galgiani, aye. Lara. Aye. Lara, aye. Leyva. Aye. Leyva, aye.
We'll hold the roll open. I'd ask for a motion to delay the start of this audit to July 2015. It's been moved. Second? It's been moved and seconded. Madam Secretary, please call the roll.
Assemblymember Gibson.
Aye.
Gibson, aye. Ashajian. Ashajian, aye. Baker. Campos. Jones. Jones, aye. Nazarian. Nazarian, aye. Rendon. Rendon, aye. Senator Roth. Roth, aye. Bell. Bell, aye. Cannella. No. Cannella, no. Fuller. Galgiani. Galgiani, aye. Lara. No. Lara, no. Leyva. Leyva, aye.
Fuller, no.
Fuller, no.
We're not done yet.
The last motion passed.
We have more?
No. Yeah, I'll do it.
Motion to delay passed. We're going to call the absent members on the first motion to approve the audit.
Approve it.
Assemblymember Baker. Campos. Nazarian. I'm sorry, Rendon.
Aye.
Rendon,
I
aye.
need to vote twice.
So I think it's approved. All right. 3 for 3.
We want to call the roll on the absent members of 2015-106. This is University of California and the California State University Funding for Public and Safety Services.
Assemblymember Ashajian.
Aye.
Ashajian, aye. Campos. Canella. Canella, aye.
I want to please call the roll, Madam Secretary, on the delayed start.
Ashajian. It's for the delayed start of the audit you just voted on.
Yes.
Ashajian, yes. Canella. Canella, aye.
Thank you. Just want to recap. We have 3 approved items and we have 2 delayed starts. I want to thank the committee for your participation and the Joint Legislative Audit Committee for March 4th, 2015 in this room. Thank you very much for your participation and your support. This meeting stands adjourned.